Well, we're back inside the New York Blower Test Lab. Now, for this example, we've secured the fan to a test base. Naturally, in a real application, we would have installed it on a proper base. Now, let's talk about startup procedures. If drive components are not supplied by New York Blower, make sure that the starting torque is adequate. If it isn't, you'll quickly burn out the motor. Inspect the fan for loose items, debris in or by the fan, and turn the wheel by hand to check for any binding. Check the drive installation and the belt tension. We'll talk more about belt drives in the next section. Check the tightness of all set screws, nuts, and bolts. Okay, all of the guards are back in place on this fan, so we're ready for startup. Now, verify supply voltage, check motor wiring, and bump the starter to confirm the correct wheel rotation. Remember to follow correct lockout-tagout procedures. And use extreme caution when testing the fan if ducting is disconnected. Make sure no one is standing near the inlet or outlet. Supply power and check for unusual sounds or vibrations. If either exists, shut the fan down immediately. When ductwork is installed, check for correct fan speed and complete the installation. And finally, set screws should be rechecked after a few minutes, 8 hours, and 2 weeks of operation. You'll find the proper set screw torques in the New York Blower's installation and maintenance literature. Well, now that we've covered installation and startup, let's turn our attention to the major maintenance items. Now, there are really 3 major components that require regular inspection and maintenance. Those are the bearings, drives, and the fan wheel. Now, we're going to bring Glenn over here to show us a few things about bearing maintenance. Glenn, how you doing?
Hi, Jim. Doing good, thanks.
Great. What are you going to be doing for us here today?
Well, Jim, I'm going to add grease to this bearing as a normal maintenance function. Now, the bearing should be purged each month because the grease will accumulate dirt and moisture. Now, that's murder on the bearing elements.
I'll bet.
It's also important that you use a grease that is compatible with the high speeds associated with fans. We typically recommend 5 different greases, each of which are NLGI Grade 2 consistency.
Can you show us the do's and the don'ts when purging the bearings?
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Great. Now watch Glenn add grease to the bearing while running the fan and rotating the shaft by hand. If you're adding grease while the fan is running, of course, make sure the guards are in place. Add just enough grease to cause a slight purging of the seals, like this. Over-lubrication can cause big headaches. Let me show you what can happen if you over-lubricate. In this example, because we've ruined the bearing seals, we'll have to replace the entire bearing, a costly and time-consuming mistake. For split pillow block bearings, the bearings should be cleaned and repacked approximately every 8 lubrications.
Right, Jim. And the fan maintenance literature includes a bearing lubrication schedule. Now, you should refer to this for the particular fan and application.
Thanks for mentioning that, Glenn. Now, it's also important to monitor bearing temperature. Bearing temperature is one indication that something is wrong with the bearing.
Right, but be careful not to touch. Oftentimes, the bearing's surface temperature can exceed 180 degrees. Ooh. That's pretty hot.
I'd say.
But in time, as the grease purges from the bearing, this temperature will drop. This purging usually takes several hours.
Good stuff to know. Real good stuff to know. And you can check bearing temperature with any temperature sensing instrument, such as RTDs, for example. Bearing temperature should normally be 180 degrees Fahrenheit or less. But the bearing temperature is highly dependent on bearing type, operating speed, and the ambient temperature. And don't forget, the bearings can be easily damaged during prolonged storage. To help prevent this, the wheel should be rotated every couple of weeks to redistribute the grease inside the bearing, and the bearing should be greased each month.